Chapter 3. Wilhelm took a ragged breath. Fragmented memories snapped back into focus. The beast. The stairs. Wilhelm's body violently caught up to his panicked mind. He snapped his eyes open. There was no beast knot anymore. The mid-afternoon sun poured through the window, washing his exhausted body in a deceptively pleasant warmth. But cotton stuffed his dry mouth, and the sanctified gore of the Inquisitor had dried into a flaking crust across his face. His canteen called to him. He unsecured it from his belt, tipping a splash of stale water over his eyes to clear the crust, then wiped the bloody, diluted mess away with the back of his free hand. The overwhelming stench of dried mud and wet musk clung to his uniform. It was soiled from his boots to his coat, the once grey wool now painted in coats of sanguine and earth. Thirst clawed at his throat. He satiated it with the remainder of his canteen, swallowing the metallic-tasting water before strapping it back into place. Wilhelm sat up. His battered body loudly protested in response, sending waves of dull pain radiating from his spine and ribs. He grabbed the heavy stock of his crossbow, shuffled his weight, and forced himself to his feet. Through the window, the abandoned district lay unnervingly peaceful. The rain had relented during his rest, and the day's encroaching heat had baked the muddy road into cracked clay. The sun perched high overhead. He had slept through the entire morning, his body robbing him of valuable daylight. With his crossbow tucked firmly into his shoulder, he methodically cleared the townhouse down to the first floor. The smell of the beast still lingered in the air, but the nightmare itself was not to be seen. His cautious footsteps echoed down the stairwell, leading him through the frozen, violent memory of the dining room and out the splintered front doorway. If he ran, he might be able to make it back to the safety of the city's inner walls before the sun fell. The dull pain blooming in his chest swiftly reminded him that running was not an option. Perhaps he would come across another patrol. But why would there be one? It was not unusual for a squad to be gone for multiple nights, especially in districts so far from the ever-shrinking safe haven. There would not yet be a reason for the church to send another party, and that would be assuming the church even found the endeavor worth risking more men. Wilhelm retraced his erratic steps from the night prior. The streets were silent. The mouth of the church mocked him from down the road as he passed its perimeter. An unwanted weight pressed against the base of his skull. The lupine beast might not be visible, but he was absolutely certain it was still watching him. His hand slipped into his side pouch and returned with a particularly tough slab of salted jerky. Penal soldiers were not afforded luxury in the way of field rations when marching outside the walls, but when a man had no other choice, his stomach made do. He gnawed on the leathery meat, stubbornly stripping off small fibrous bits at a time to stave off the hunger. The afternoon bled away into a grueling march. He stuck close to the decaying buildings, carefully weaving through collapsed masonry and shadowed alleys, deliberately avoiding long, open stretches of visibility. This specific lupine beast might not be actively attacking him, but there were no guarantees regarding the mindless plague-born he might cross paths with. He hadn't imagined the unwanted attention. The beast was still with him. Several times throughout the trek, he had caught the dark blur of it in his periphery of fluid shadow, slipping silently through a parallel alleyway. An unnatural, predatory silence surrounded him like the eye of a hurricane. It kept its distance, and Wilhelm could at least be thankful for that small mercy. But now, the skeletal shadows of the ruins grasped long across the ground. The pale sun was preparing to drop beneath the jagged skyline. He needed somewhere to hole up for the night. This time, he preferred a place with a little more privacy. His path ended at the entrance of a two-story inn. Wooden boards were stacked haphazardly upon each other, barricading the lower window frames. The main entrance's heavy oak door was missing, ripped from its hinges, but the overall damage was minuscule compared to the hollowed-out husks he kept passing. The familiar, comforting weight of the crossbow settled into his shoulder as Wilhelm breached the threshold. The dying remnants of the evening sun pierced through the narrow gaps in the boarded windows, casting dusty blades of light across the floorboards. His eyes clinically scanned the interior. Both floors were visible from the doorway. The first floor was dominated by a long, wooden, bar-overturned stools, tables, and forgotten ornaments scattered haphazardly across the room. A grand stairwell climbed toward the vaulted ceiling before splitting to follow the perimeter walls. Each path led to an elevated catwalk connecting the entrances of several lodging rooms. Every single door on the second floor was shut tight, bearing no visible signs of structural damage or forced entry. The tight knot of tension in his shoulders finally slackened, and he allowed the heavy iron nose of the crossbow to drift towards the floorboards. A few steps ahead of him, a solitary leather hat rested on the planks. It was a strange, out-of-place thing, entirely unmarked by the thick layer of dust that coated the rest of the inn. Perhaps another patrol had passed through here recently. Wilhelm snagged the hat from the floor and deposited both it and his weapon on the bar top. A neat line of dusty crystal glasses sat upside down, waiting patiently to be flipped for their next patron. He temporarily ignored them in favor of the stocked liquor racks displayed behind the counter. His calloused hand settled over a sealed bottle of clear vodka. He twisted it open, settled back onto the surprisingly sturdy stool, and flipped a glass for himself before pouring his prize. The lupine was certainly still with him. But if it truly wanted him dead, vodka or not, his fate was already sealed. His dry lips curled in an exhausted grin before he belted out a sudden raspy bark of laughter. If he were lucky, the monster would waltz right in and take the stool next to him so he could pour it a drink too. He glanced back over his shoulder at the empty doorway, lifting his crystal glass in the gloom with a mock theatrical cheer. "Oh, would you like a drink? Come, tell me about yourself." He swung back toward the bar top and drained a heavy measure from his glass. The cheap liquor burned like liquid fire down his throat. The foul aftertaste immediately made him gag, coughing the harsh fumes out into the quiet room. The spirit was certainly not the smoothest liquor the city had to offer, but when a man found water in a drought, who would rightfully deny it? It had been an unusual day. Putting aside his lupine shadow, even considering his careful crawl of a pace, it was unheard of to travel an entire day without encountering a single mindless plague-born. Was the presence of the beast keeping the mindless horrors at bay, or had Lady Luck finally turned in his favor? The memory of the inner city invaded his thoughts. Wilhelm was already treading on thin ice with the church, having been caught nicking unattended gear from cellwards who had drunk far more than their rightful fill of ale. A penal soldier returning without his assigned inquisitor. At the bare minimum, eyebrows would be raised, and harsh interrogations would follow. If he was unlucky, he would be accused of murder or abandonment. And if God truly had his name marked, perhaps both. But it was best not to worry about the gallows until he actually made it back in one piece. He swallowed another burning swig. The light thud of the glass against the hardwood offered a fleeting comfort. Wilhelm closed his eyes, letting his mind drift. Before the rot, before the beasts, before all of hell had descended upon mankind, there was the warmth of a hearth fire. The roaring merriment of men celebrating the end of a long week. The smell of fresh hot bread, broken apart to be dipped in thick beef stew. His breath plumed from his open mouth as he leaned forward onto the counter, allowing his exhausted body a few stolen seconds of rest. The fine hairs on the nape of his neck slowly rose. His eyes snapped open, instantly locking onto the crystal glass. In its curved reflection, a massive, dark shape hung directly behind him. Long, spindly limbs were spread wide, silently reaching out to embrace his back. It was not the lupine. Instinct seized him. He violently kicked off the stool, launching himself over the bar top. His heavy frame slammed hard into the liquor cabinets and display racks. A deafening cacophony of shattering glass erupted across the wooden floor as bottles and crystal alike exploded. Their potent contents flooded the planks, pooling into a noxious alcoholic mixture that threatened to burn his lungs with its fumes. Sharp pain erupted in his shoulder as a full, unbroken bottle struck him during its fall, a second one rolling heavily off his chest. Above him, the nightmare scrambled over the edge of the bar top. The first horror that met his gaze was its head. It was human, or at least, it used to be. Its eyes were pitch-black pools like any other plague. Born, but they had fractured and segmented into dozens of smaller, glistening orbs. The creature's jaw gaped open in a silent scream. The chin split cleanly down the middle like jagged pincers. Stripped of all flesh, the raw, exposed bone dripped with a thick, viscous grey fluid. The skull was twisted backward at a sickening, unnatural angle, fusing directly into the remnants of an impossibly bloated human torso wrapped in skin like rotted dark leather. And its limsa, dozen black-haired, arachnid-like legs, each several feet long, erupted from the torso at erratic angles. Shards of broken glass bit at his heavy wool coat, the dense fabric taking the brunt of the damage. Wilhelm's eyes darted frantically, searching the interior of the bar for where his crossbow fell. It had clattered across the floorboards, coming to rest entirely out of his reach. Not enough time. It was too far. The beast's bristling legs flailed over the ledge, finding impossible grips on the polished wood. They reached down, grasping blindly at Wilhelm's side. He rolled away, feeling the sharp tips of the appendages pressing against his back. He reached for his hip. The stolen steel of the Inquisitor's rapier hissed as it began to clear its leather scabbard, but it was cut short. His elbow slammed against the wooden cabinet. The rapier was temporarily forgotten as a blinding shock shot up his arm, the muscles seizing, forcing his grip open. The legs found their hold, hooking into his uniform to forcefully drag Wilhelm underneath the beast's suspended torso. On its underside, located at what would be the base of its bloated stomach, a puckering, fleshy orifice dripped with a foul, unknown substance. Wilhelm threw out his good arm, his bare hand desperately dredging through the spilled spirits and debris. Jagged shards sliced into his palm, the high-proof liquor immediately setting his opened wounds on fire. His fingers finally clamped around a thick, curved shard from a heavy bottle. The jagged edge bit deep into his own flesh as he thrust it wildly upward, stabbing at the bristling limbs pressing down on him. A foul-smelling, dark crimson sprayed from the first sliced leg. Then a second, and a third. A sickening, wet gurgle vibrated from its sloughed jaw. Dark, heavy globs of the grey fluid splattered across Wilhelm's face, trailing down his cheek. He thrashed wildly in its iron grip. The oozing grey globs sizzled, burning into his skin like acid. With a roar of pain, he dropped the bloodied glass shard, using his mangled hand to frantically wipe the caustic fluid from his face. The deadened nerves in his right arm finally sparked back to life. He frantically reached for the rapier a second time. His fingers locked around the wire grip, pulling the blade free just as his left hand was violently pinned against his chest by a new assault. The beast's puckered orifice sprayed thick, damp webbing over him. Its dozen legs hoisted him off the floorboards, spinning him in midair. Like a fly caught in a nightmare's trap, he was turned round and round as the heavy web encased him. Fighting the binding, he reared his free arm back, driving the rapier upward in a desperate blind stab toward the creature's center of mass. The razor-sharp steel slipped deep into its bloated chest. The beast shrieked and recoiled, dropping him. Wilhelm slammed hard against the ground, sending a blinding jolt of pain shooting up his bruised spine. Refusing to yield, he thrust the blade again and again toward the looming nightmare. The arachnid arms reached down in a frenzy, several pinning his chest and legs to the floorboards. The muscles in his sword arms screamed in agony as the beast's remaining limbs repeatedly smashed against it like heavy clubs. A final, brutal strike knocked the rapier completely from his weakened grasp, sending the steel skidding uselessly into the darkness. The looming certainty of his own death dropped like a cold stone in his chest. Anything. He needed anything to stop this. His free hand scrambled blindly through the dark of the bar cabinet beside him. His fingers grazed a wooden handle attached to a cold lick of iron. The moment he closed his fist around it, the beast violently jerked his arm, pinning it flat against his chest. He was hauled up toward the creature's sloughing, bloated torso. It spun him. Thick, damp webbing sprayed from its undulating orifice, wrapping him in tight, suffocating coils. The web bound his legs together and plastered his arms against his ribs. He squeezed his eyes shut as the wet adhesive washed over his face, sealing him in absolute darkness. Vertigo washed over him as the rapid rotation spun his equilibrium, leaving his stomach lurching violently. Then, the frantic spinning ceased. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural. A sharp jolt. Wilhelm was hoisted from the floorboards by his feet. He was ascending in half-foot jerks, pulled straight up toward the vaulted ceiling. He forced his eyes open, peering through the sticky, translucent strands crisscrossing his vision. The front entrance of the tavern came into view. Standing just beyond the threshold, the lupine. Even through the darkness, he recognized its silhouette. It sat perfectly still. Its wolfish skull was tilted slightly to the side. No movement, no urgency, no action. It was just watching. Had it tracked him all this way just to spectate his execution? Anger flared hot and sudden, burning away the mounting panic in his chest. Of course it had. He had stumbled right into a predator's trap, and he brought an audience with him. Wilhelm thrashed within the cocoon. Against his trapped hand, his fist shifted freely. The webbing yielded against a sharp edge. It was a blade, a simple paring knife used for slicing fruit, but a blade nonetheless. He worked his wrist, sawing blindly at his fibrous cage. Every other second, the beast pulled him another half-foot into the air. First, his hand broke free. Then he carved upward, shredding the bindings around his arm until he could rip it loose. The second-floor catwalk drew level with his head. With his right arm free, he slashed wildly across his left side, tearing through the webbing until both arms were mobile. He ripped the sticky veil from his face and sucked in a desperate, deep breath. 2 more downward slices freed his waist and separated his legs. His ascent stopped. The arachnid realized its prey was loose and began to lower itself down an anchor line, its many legs twitching in anticipation. Wilhelm swung his blade toward his bound feet, trying to sever the primary strand hoisting him. But his attempts were unsuccessful. He could not make the angle. He jerked his body weight, swinging himself like a pendulum, but the effort was in vain. The beast descended upon him. Brackish, hairy legs wrapped around his back, forcefully pulling its torso toward him. He was running out of time. With a final, desperate surge, Wilhelm swung his upper body toward the creature. He reached out with his bare hand and grabbed one half of the beast's split jaw. The acidic fluid immediately seared his palm, burning into his flesh like hot coals. Ignoring the blinding agony, he used the creature's jaw as a point of leverage, hoisting himself up just enough to swing the fruit knife beyond his bound feet. He severed the anchor strand. Gravity took him. Wilhelm plummeted, but as he fell, the blade in his flailing arm caught the beast's swollen flesh. The sheer force of his falling weight dragged the small knife in a long, devastating line through the creature's torso. Crimson, foul-smelling ichor erupted from the wound, spraying across Wilhelm in a hot sheet. He struck the wooden floorboards flat on his back. The air was forcefully ejected from his lungs. Agony flared through his already battered spine. Directly above him, the beast smashed onto the bar counter in a thrashing heap. Wilhelm wheezed, his vision swimming and his body screaming in protest. The knife was gone, left buried in the creature. His rapier lay somewhere in the unseen shadows. The crossbow. He had landed near it, the heavy wooden stock resting only a few feet from his grasp. He rolled onto his stomach, crawling across the slick floorboards. Stray shards sliced into his palms, every frantic movement crunching against the broken tavern glass. Behind him, the creature righted itself. Its bristling legs skittered down against the face of the bar, reaching blindly for him. The spindly limbs hooked around Wilhelm's ankles. They pulled. He stretched his arm out, as far as the socket would allow. It dragged him backward. His outstretched fingertips grazed the wooden stock. He seized it. Ignoring the searing pain that doused his nerves in liquid fire, Wilhelm violently twisted onto his back to meet the creature once again. He gripped the weapon with both hands. The beast loomed just beyond his boots, its spindly legs tightening their hold on his body. Its ruined, sloughing jaw gnashed hungrily, those segmented eyes staring blankly down at him. This time, he didn't hesitate. The heavy steel bolt punched through the bone just above its nasal cavity, carving a hollow tunnel straight through its skull. The effect was instantaneous. The beast collapsed under its own weight, dropping like a stone. The bloated corpse landed across his legs with a heavy, wet thud, spewing foul lifeblood from the cavernous hole in its face. Wilhelm kicked the twitching dead limbs away and dragged his body out. Slivers of broken glass bit into his hands as he forced himself to stand, tearing the last sticky remnants of webbing from his coat. The adrenaline that had kept him alive violently crashed. His stomach convulsed. Doubling over, he vomited a searing mixture of cheap vodka and acidic bile across the already slick floorboards. Gasping for air, he pulled himself upright, leaving the empty crossbow exactly where it lay. He limped around the edge of the bar, his eyes scanning the room until the dull gleam of the rapier caught his attention. He snatched it from the ground and squared his shoulders toward the tavern's entrance. The lupine was gone. Of course it was. It had stood there, a silent spectator to his desperate struggle, and the second he survived, it had vanished back into the gloom. What did it want from him? Wilhelm shoved past the splintered doorframe, leaving the spider's nest behind. The night air was freezing. The hard wind chill pierced his soaked, shredded coat, biting viciously at his acid-burned skin. He was trembling, but the cold was quickly eclipsed by hot fury. He held his rapier out, its steel tip shaking in the pitch-black street. He spun, his chest heaving as his eyes raked over the deep charcoal shadows, scanning the narrow alleys and hollowed-out entrances. It was playing with him. It could be anywhere, watching from just out of sight, observing him like some caged specimen. "Come on," his voice lashed out, fracturing the dead silence of the district. "Just fucking come out. And done with this." He spun wildly, half expecting the massive, dark, lupine form to materialize in front of him and finally tear his throat out like it had the others. But nothing moved. The night offered only its agonizing, stifling silence. The sheer frustration of it broke whatever fight he had left. With a guttural yell, Wilhelm hurled the rapier onto the cobblestone. His legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in the filth, screaming his sheer exhaustion and rage for the uncaring beast to hear. He stayed there in the mud for an unknown amount of time, his head bowed until his ragged breathing finally returned to normal. And then far ahead of him, a light. Piercing the suffocating gloom, a warm amber glow flickered. A torch. It was unmistakable. Wilhelm scrambled to his feet, a desperate, hysterical relief flooding his chest. He broke into a ragged jog, flailing his arms wildly in the dark. "Hey!" He drew a deep, burning breath from his exhausted diaphragm and roared. "Over! Here!" The torchlight paused. Wilhelm rapidly closed the distance, his boots slapping heavily against the road. As the gap narrowed, the dancing amber shadows stretched and coalesced into the distinct, rigid silhouettes of armored men. He was safe. He slowed to an exhausted walk as he neared them, his body threatening to seize with every step. He knew he looked the part of a madman drenched in foul ichor, his uniform shredded and reeking of cheap spirits and fresh blood. His skin was smeared with a sickening mixture of dried caustic fluids. He peeled to a halt a mere few paces away. At the front of the formation stood the unmistakably imposing figure of an inquisitor, flanked by men Wilhelm assumed were either green sellswords or terrified conscripts. Wilhelm's cracked lips stretched, pure joy overcoming his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but the inquisitor simply raised a black-gloved hand in a sharp, unspoken command. A heavy, steel-toed boot swept out from the line, slamming into the back of Wilhelm's calves. His legs were kicked entirely out from beneath him. He crashed hard onto his knees, a new spike of pain rocketing up his shins. Before he could even draw a breath to gasp, rough, splintered timber scraped against the sensitive skin of his neck. A heavy wooden yoke, carved into the shape of a cruel horseshoe, was violently shoved down over his shoulders. Wilhelm Gruber. The Inquisitor's voice held a biting edge, carrying the cold, mechanical cadence of a practiced executioner. "I stand here today to ensure you receive justice for your crimes against God, the Church, and your fellow man. You have consorted with demons and abandoned your duty to humanity." Thick leather clasps snapped shut, securing the yoke. A heavy iron chain rattled as it dropped against his chest. Wilhelm struggled against the stifling timber, desperately trying to rise. "Inquis." A metal gauntleted fist hammered into the base of his skull. Wilhelm jolted forward, his teeth clacking violently together. Hot, metallic blood flooded his mouth. His vision blurred, the harsh torchlight smearing into long, erratic streaks of burning orange. "Consider yourself lucky, boy," the Inquisitor continued over the high-pitched ringing in Wilhelm's ears. A leather glove seized his jaw, viciously yanking his head up. Wilhelm squinted, fighting a losing battle to keep his swimming vision focused on the holy man's face. "You will have your opportunity to speak before a magister. Press your luck, and you'll receive an audience with the Lord first." The Inquisitor shoved Wilhelm's jaw aside and pivoted sharply, his black cloak sweeping dismissively against Wilhelm's bleeding cheek. Utter desperation and betrayed fury warred within his chest. He attempted to stand, forcing a ruined plea through his lips, but the words came out half-formed in unintelligible, wet mass of syllables forcibly strummed together by pain. A mace struck the back of his knee with a sharp, sickening crack. The joint instantly gave way. Wilhelm collapsed, his head smacking against the cobblestone road. The yoke dug painfully into his windpipe, pinning him with its suddenly impossible weight. He lay there, his cheek resting in the freezing filth slickened over the stone. He closed his eyes. Every other sense was stripped away until his entire focus on the living world was reduced to the contact between his skin and the stone. His ragged breathing slowed. His consciousness ebbed, retreating and returning like an ocean wave. He was in a forest. Endless, towering conifers stretched into the grey mist, spotted with jagged mountain peaks clawing like daggers towards the heavens. He felt it. That beast, watching him. A howl. That unholy howler sound caught somewhere within the bounds of a wolf, a man, and a god. It reverberated through his very being. The sheer crushing force of its will threatened to drown him. The last fragile pillar of defiance within him collapsed. His spirit prostrated itself under its command. Darkness rushed back in. The frantic, slipping scramble of boots, heavy and panicked against the earth. Something thick and hot scattered across his cheek. The sudden, visceral screams of terrified men. A crying, gurgling plea. Silence. Warmth. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of a leather-clad finger against the hardwood station and the crackling of the fire pit behind it. The firelight caught the scarred remnants of an old injury across Inquisitor Frederick's face, reflecting dully in his milky left eye as he leaned over the organized stacks of church directives. His desk was meticulously kept, reports, statements, and mandates all neatly stacked according to their purpose. So, Leonard, across from Frederick, leaning precariously forward on the edge of a borrowed chair, sat the penal soldier. Dried mud still splattered his face and uniform, carrying the foul stench of the outer districts. You mean to tell me that after witnessing the death of your superior, this beast who slaughtered your peers inspidescently, that you walk away? Leonard writhed in his seat, the wood groaning under his panicked shifting. No, I ran, Inquisitor. I ran straight here. It chased me, but I slipped away from it. Vincent had been a good man, and an even better Inquisitor, one of his best, if he had to choose. It was a bitter thing to lose a man of his caliber to a beast, especially when they'd been forced to repeatedly scrape the barrel for replacements. However, he wasn't ignorant. He had trawled over the recent reports. This was no ordinary plague-born. It was an anomaly, its true nature barely obscured by the sheer volume of reports and encounter logs. It was not mentioned by specific designation. Scouting reports detailed something trailing the patrols, making no attempts to engage or be engaged. Examinations of the deceased found in that sector matched a distinct, deliberate pattern of death knot, the frenzied tearing of a mindless, hungry thing, but surgical execution. Old wood creaked as Frederick leaned back. Explain again to me what you informed my associates. Frederick listened in silence as Leonard recited his tale. The man claimed he had fallen behind before the fighting broke out. By the time he caught up, he witnessed Wilhelm collaborating with the beast. He launched into frantic, breathless detail regarding its nightmarish appearance. Frederick lifted a quill from his inkpot, scrawling notes as Leonard spun his web. Wilhelm had betrayed the Inquisitor, Leonard claimed, disarming him and skewering the holy man with his own blade before ordering the beast to consume his flesh. Wilhelm had then allegedly attempted to coerce Leonard to join him, the penal nature of their work giving them shared, treacherous reason. Frederick let him continue. It was abundantly clear that whatever the truth of the night was, this was not it. Unfortunately, one of his subordinates, a man who clung tighter to glory than to reason, had already set out to retrieve the accused, or, more likely, by proper estimation, to confirm his death. The fool had not consulted him, nor had he waited for a proper veteran force to be organized. If this beast were anything akin to Leonard's description, marching into its lair so hastily was a dead man's errand. But it was, temporarily, a settled matter. He would stay his hand until their hopeful return. If the accused turned up dead, the church would treat it as a clear-cut, closed case. It was exactly the simple, neat narrative that silenced uncomfortable questions. However, should the patrol return with the manor in the increasingly likely event they do not return at all within 3 days' time, he would take the matter into his own hands for a proper investigation. What a waste of valuable souls. Leonard sat silently across from him, his body visibly trembling against the cushion. Inquisitor Frederick had let the discomfort stew, stretching the silence until it was suffocating. Finally, Frederick stood. He folded his hands behind his back and turned to inspect the fire. You left a man of the cloth to perish. The flames licked upwards, chewing at the outer layer of the logs. You allowed your squadmate to be swayed by a daemon. Frederick turned to face Leonard. The soldier had paled, pressing himself as far back as the seat would allow him. Frederick's boots clicked against the floorboards as he closed the distance, looming over the cowering man like an executioner. Even in these times, where the necessity of every man has increased tenfold, you have shown yourself time and time again to be a dereliction of your responsibilities. Leonard was unable to meet his accusing gaze. Inquisitor, it's not my fault, I swear. The church has no use for cowards, son. Friedrich grabbed the back of Leonard's chair and spun it violently with a kick of his boot. A shepherd does not flee the wolf. Before him sat a mockery of a man. Even in his lowly station, Leonard brought more danger upon his fellows than simple inaction ever would. Death would be too kind a mercy. Yet, even without a shred of honor, there was still a use for him. He was no fool. The church needed every warm body it could spare to hold the line against the rot. Friedrich returned to his desk and sat. He allowed the silence to hang for a few final seconds, letting his utter disdain for this man settle over the room. Report to the penal garrison commander for your reassignment. Not waiting for the man to scramble out of the room, Friedrich tore the pages of meticulous notes from his journal and tossed the lies into the hungry flames.